So, best practices. I know that we've got a bunch of different kinds of problem-solving courts in the room. At NADCP, we have best practices for adult drug courts. And I get asked a lot, all the time, why is that? Why don't we have best practice standards for every kind of problem-solving court? When we first put together the committee to look at these standards, which has now been over a decade ago, we agreed that in order to have something called standards, and standards is an extremely high level, we really needed to agree that the evidence needed to be strong enough to tell the courts, you ought to do this. Does that make sense? So we were talking about meta-analysis a little while ago. Well, in adult drug courts, we have that amount of research. We have a good amount of research for other problem-solving courts, but not to the level we do of adult. Does that make sense? So while we will be developing best practice standards for all problem-solving courts, for right now, the adult are finished. So I hope that explains that piece. In talking to the researchers, we can certainly surmise that some of the research that we're going to go through today does cross over, but again, there is a growing and robust body of research about other problem-solving court models. So why do we have standards in general, though? Well, we talked a little bit about in the opening how long drug courts have been around, and it's interesting. Without standards, it's hard to have a firm footing. We actually, drug courts get criticism all the time. I mean, a lot of the criticism comes to my office, so I hear it, and they get criticism all the time. And I've heard a lot of folks talk about, researchers, for example, will talk about, as drug courts, like any other field, no matter what field that you're in, whether it's fair or not, you will be judged by the programs that are worst programs, right? Because those are the ones that enter the page. I mean, we have how many fantastic programs around the country, but what we see up here on the slide is that 9% of drug courts actually do harm. 9% of estimated the research do harm. And that doesn't mean that, of course, that they're malicious. It just means that their outcomes are negative. Now, when you talk to folks who go out and do research on drug courts, what they would say about these programs is that if Jeff were to go and be reviewing them, he probably would not even recognize them as being a drug court. They don't have the 10 key components, much less the standards. They call themselves a drug court, but they're not a drug court to go look at them. It's like I could call myself a Rolls Royce, but if I'm a Ford Explorer, I can call myself a Rolls Royce all day long, but I'm not that. But it still creates a problem. So then, one thing when we were discussing developing standards, well, if you have best practice standards, then you can ask the critical question, do you have this? Do you have that? Do you have the other? But it also helps raise all ships. It helps raise all of us look to what does the research say in certain areas we need to have the best outcomes. Now, are the best practice standards exhaustive for adult drug courts? Do they cover every possible thing we can do in court? No. There's not research on every possible thing. There's 10 standards, and we're going to review the first volume and go through the second volume this morning. But keep in mind, I don't anticipate there will always be 10 standards. I anticipate that there is more research that comes out, and we'll have additional best practice standards. So as there's more research in certain areas, we will build on the best practice standards. So volume 1, I'm going to review quickly, and we're going to spend more time on volume 2, which is the most recent one. Volume 1's been out for a few years, and volume 2 is more recent. So this one you'll probably have heard most about, especially since when I asked the question a few minutes ago, most folks in this room have been doing drug court for longer than 2 years. So hopefully you've already heard a lot about the standards, and I know that you've got a rigorous system in your state. So just to review volume 1. We started, the very first standard is target population. And basically what that is who should you bring into your adult drug court? Who they work best for. And the group that worked on the standards for all these years decided that the order of the standards made a difference, and that we needed to start with target population first, because all the other standards follow that. If you're not bringing in the right group of people, we can't necessarily say any of the other standards apply. Does that make sense? If you think about it, it's like if I'm if I'm an oncologist and I'm treating cancer patients, there's probably a lot of things that I would do that would, if Jeff's a podiatrist, that would be basic medical stuff that would be the same. But certainly, if I'm not getting cancer patients, if I'm getting his patients, from that step, from that first step, a lot of the other things that I should do as a best practice are not going to apply. They're just not going to apply. So are you taking in the right people? What we know from the research is that adult drug courts work best for folks who are high risk, high need. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail because I'm sure y'all have heard that 100 times, but just to review, when we're talking about high risk, we're not talking about dangerous people. We're talking about people that are high risk for reoffending. And there are risk assessment tools, and they're talked about all over the country now. People have, do you have a validated risk assessment tool? So do folks on a risk assessment tool score as being at high risk? All right, if I'm in your court, or referred to your court, and if I get a lower level of care, am I at a high risk for reoffending? Basically, the way I think about it kind of just colloquially is, am I one of those folks who, but for drug court, is destined to spend my life in and out of the justice system my entire life? And we all work with these folks throughout our career. The other thing is high need. So it's not just that I have, I score high on a risk, I also have high needs. So I have substance use disorder, mental health disorder, and again, these are the folks that y'all are seeing in adult drug courts every day. The second standard is historically disadvantaged groups. I'm sorry. So we also then decided, because the order seemed to be important in doing the standards, so there was a lot of discussion, what needs to be standard number 2? We recognize that drug courts, to begin with, need to be fair. They need to be fair. So we talked about, well, what would the second standard be? And so we talked about that drug courts needed to be fair to folks, no matter if they were a man or a woman, or black and white, if it was a Native Americans in your court, if you had veterans in your court, whoever was coming into your court, we had to look at them as a person and be fair. And so standard number 2 looks to that and actually gives the court kind of a responsibility to take a look at itself and ask, is everyone coming into your program, do they mirror the population of folks who should be coming in? And I'll just kind of put this in a just a nuts and bolts. I've worked with jurisdictions. There was a jurisdiction I worked with in California, and I think Jeff's probably heard the story. And they had a population in their particular community. They had a lot of folks who were immigrants from Latin America, and but when they opened their drug court, the folks who fit that particular profile were dropping out within the first, really, at referral stage. They were being referred. They were going for their first interviews, like you would do in a drug court, if I'm referring to your drug court, and they would drop out. And they were dropping out in huge numbers. Well, what they did in the process evaluation was they looked at all the things they were asking, and they realized that one thing they were asking was detailed questions about family and family connections and stuff like that. And that was just so that, if I worked for the court, that I would know who do I contact in case of an emergency. But the way that it was read was, are you trying to find out if there's folks in this community who are here maybe not legally? And so it was read as the system was trying to pry in and find out information, and so people were dropping out. So it's just a matter of being fair and taking a look at it. Again, not maliciously. It wasn't that the questionnaire was written in a malicious way. It was just kind of taking a look through the eyes of the folks that were in the program. But then also looking at, not only are folks getting into your program, but how are they doing in the program? Is everybody who's coming into the program getting the services that they need? And then how are folks doing, how are they graduating? So for example, let's say that you bring in your drug court, 50% of the folks are men and 50% are women. But let's say your graduates are only 10% women. That's something the court should look at and should try to correct for, right? So that's what Standard 2 says, is that look for these problems and then correct for them. Do you have the necessary treatment and other interventions in place? So number 3, the roles and responsibilities of the judge. Drug courts are different from standard justice system case processing for a variety of ways. Perhaps the largest way is the role of the judge and how that role is different than standard court processing. And because of that, when drug courts first started 25, 27 years ago, there was a lot of questions. Well, do we need this judicial role? Can't we just do this drug court thing and have these same outcomes without this judge? And there was research done on that that actually showed when they pulled the judge that had all the same components in place, their outcomes dropped by half. So the answer was very clear. No, you have to have the judicial role if you want the same outcomes. What the roles and responsibilities of the judge, what we were able to do in that standard was to answer some questions that I've been asked for 20 years that honestly up until the last few years we did not have answers for. Questions like judges asking, well, how often should I see folks? And we were able to say, well, in the first phase of the program, at least every other week. We, and you ask the researchers sometimes, and Jeff and I might ask a researcher, well, would it be better to see them every week? And they might say, well, it might be for a high-risk, high-needs population, but when you look at the courts all together, it looks like every other week works fine, which can make a big difference. I was actually working with a court in the last 3 weeks, and they were running into a big resource problem. They're looking at a big expansion. And they've been meeting with the first phase every week for years. Realizing that they could go to every other week was tremendous for them because it was going to allow them to grow their program by 2 or 3 times because they were going to be able to not see outcomes drop that go from every week to every other week in phase 1. Does that make sense? Incentive sanctions and therapeutic adjustments, I won't go through too much because I'm doing a whole session on incentives and sanctions in the conference. So what you'll see at that session is that there's a huge body of literature on incentives and sanctions, on what motivates behavior. And not just for folks in drug court, but for any of us. There are things that motivate our behavior as people. And so drug courts take advantage of behavioral research in applying incentives and sanctions. We want to respond to behavior that when folks are not doing what they should do in the form of a sanction. But the one thing that we can't lose sight of that drug courts, and this is another way when I mentioned that the judicial role is one of the big ways that drug courts are different from standard justice system processing. Incentives is perhaps the other way that they're dramatically different. The court system does not, in normal justice system case processing, incentivize folks, other than maybe if you are found not guilty, or in a civil case if you prevail. But in drug courts, providing incentives as people accomplish certain goals throughout the program. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more when we talk about incentives and sanctions, the power of incentives and how incentives and sanctions working together through the research help people affect long-term behavior change. Substance use treatment and having it be evidence-based is critical for the success of any drug court. And one thing that I have seen anecdotally, and this has actually come to me almost completely from treatment providers who have told me that having drug courts spring up in communities has, in many communities, raised the bar on substance use treatment, the quality of it. Because what you have in many of those communities has happened is a judge has gone to a conference like this conference and has learned about evidence-based treatment and then has demanded that in their community. We need to have treatment. Are you doing annualized treatment? And has started to ask for questions that were never asked before. And many times I'll talk, like I said, to treatment providers who maybe have wanted to do certain types of therapies but weren't allowed to, or there was pushback, and having a drug court in their community actually raised the bar on treatment services. One thing that you get there, not just, this is practically, but not just from the judge, is oftentimes, and Jeff referred to federal funding this morning, is that you'll have funding restrictions and you can't actually get funding unless you're using evidence-based care. If you look at Standard 5 and read through it, it references medically assisted treatment. Jeff talked about that this morning in detail. It references evidence-based treatment, including MAT, and gives you really a detailed and comprehensive outline based on the research of what you should have in substance use treatment available in your drug court. But we all know that there's other treatment that's needed other than substance use, and so that's covered in the other standards. So, complementary treatment in social services, and we're going to go more into this in a second. We're going to talk about drug and alcohol testing. I'm going to quickly just go through this slide because I've got multiple slides that follow that explains each of these. The team, Jeff referred to the team this morning. There's so much research that's been done on the team. Because again, the question was asked, well, can't we just do this with 2 people or 3 people? And so there's been a lot of research done. I was a prosecutor. Is it necessary for prosecutors? Is it necessary to have a defense attorney? And so research has been done going in and kind of querying out each of us as a discipline and asking, are each of us necessary? And the research has shown that we are. That not only outcomes, how well our court does, but also cost savings depend on us being there. And I think it's nice for us to hear that. I mean, we only have right now a best practice standard really for one role, and that's the role of the judge. We have a treatment standard, but it's not that's for treatment in general. It's not for a treatment provider. We have it for a judge. And I explained to y'all the reason that is that's because there was so much criticism early on of drug courts that was, well, do we need that role? That was such a departure. There was research done specifically on the role of the judge. It's quite possible that the farther along we get, the more mature drug courts get, that one day we'll actually have a best practice standard for more of the disciplines. But for now, we do have one on the judge. What we have that's nice, though, is no matter what your role is in the drug court team, if you're a case manager, probation officer, law enforcement officer, prosecutor, defense attorney, somewhere in the standards is research pertaining specifically to you and how critical you are to this process. Sorry. Right. We're going to talk a little bit about census and caseloads. That's the shortest standard, but we thought it was critical to have it in there because it was information that I would say that in the process of developing the standards, if there was anything in the research that made people take a step back more than anything else, it was census and caseload. It was the idea that when drug courts, with this research was looking at courts all across the country, and again we talk about meta-analysis, hundreds and hundreds of courts, and literally tens and tens of thousands of participants, that when courts reached a certain level, they needed to hold the mirror to themselves to be sure that they were maintaining fidelity to the model. Because what the researchers saw across the board, almost without exception, was when they didn't hold that mirror up and they got a certain size, they got kind of too big or up to it's 125 to 150 participants, that their outcomes were dropping. And I remember working on the standards and talking to the researchers about this, and they would say, that becomes, it seems like, a trigger point for courts in general. When they reach a certain size, it's easy to say, well, you know, we've got so many people, maybe we don't have to meet every other week. Maybe every 6 weeks is fine. You know, it's a lot of folks. Maybe we don't really need to have this staffing. Maybe we don't need to send people to, these treatment groups. Maybe they could just go to, self-help meetings. Maybe they could just, we don't need to really test people twice a week. Once a month is probably good. We get a bunch of people. And that's it. So maybe just once a month. And starting to cut corners. And as they did that, the commonality in programs all across the country was that if they weren't holding the mirror up and making adjustments to assure that they were meeting the standards, that they would see their outcomes drop. It's not I don't think, a surprise for any of us. I think the surprise is, for me, was that there seemed to be a commonality among any court, no matter where you work. You could be in Billings or Cleveland or whatever, with that stat, there was some magic to that number, with 125 to 150 people. That's when courts started to lose fidelity. And then monitoring and evaluation, it's interesting. It's kind of a bookend because we would have none of the information in any of the 9 standards if it weren't for courts doing good monitoring and evaluation. If courts don't keep good numbers, don't evaluate themselves, and also, along with that, participate in large national evaluations, which have given us some of the other numbers that we have. So let's talk about complementary treatment. I'm not going to read the slide. Y'all can read it. I hope y'all can read it from where you are. We all know, for folks who come into drug court, when I'm talking to folks like a Chamber of Commerce, they're not like, y'all know about drug courts. They know nothing about drug courts. Well, I'll be talking to them or they'll ask me questions about it, even when I'm talking to, for example, like my sister. And people talk about drug and alcohol treatment. I'll say, yeah, but what you have to realize when you're working in a drug court is that drug and alcohol treatment might be the thumb. It's critical. But the folks in these programs need all the fingers too. You have to do that wraparound services. They're going to have all kinds of issues. They're going to need potentially mental health treatment. They're potentially going to need housing services, right? What else? Y'all tell me. What else? I'm in your adult drug court. Somebody tell me. Vocational. I don't have a job. So anybody else? Transportation issues. And then on and on and on. There's an exercise that we started doing at NADCP, I felt like 18 or 19 years ago, where in helping teams start a brand new drug court team, we would ask them, can you list all the characteristics of, if Carson is the typical person coming to your drug court, what are the characteristics he might present with? And then to bookend that with, what do you want those characteristics to be when Carson graduates from the program? So he doesn't have transportation. He's got reliable transportation. He is not. He has substance use disorder. He's actively engaged in treatment, et cetera, and to mirror those. And no matter, and I've worked with literally hundreds and hundreds of courts around the country, and there are commonalities to every jurisdiction, every community, when you see those same issues presenting themselves. So you have to look at what scope of services you have. The timing of services is important. I'm not going to go into details. Y'all can read the standards, but I've certainly worked with programs in the past where a program was so proud because they had the requirements, for example, of someone who was in phase 1. But when I looked at those requirements, I thought to myself, I couldn't do this. I mean, I think of myself as being mildly fully functional. And I couldn't do what the program was asking me to do. And these folks were having to find a job and then all kinds of things. They were being programmed for 14 or 15 hours a day. So looking to when people can expect to do stuff. If you've got a program, for example, and I'm coming into your program and I'm now using heroin. Before that I used meth. I'm also a polysubstance user, so I kind of use what I can get. I'm drinking a 6-pack or a 12-pack a day, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't had a job in 12 years. I never graduated from high school. And a requirement of your program within the first month is I'm gainfully employed. That's probably unlikely to happen. And what if you compound on top of that, you've got a jurisdiction or you've got a community where the unemployment rate is 17%. And so it's not asking people to do things that are setting them up to fail, to actually placing them at the right time. Having clinical case management, which is absolutely critical, housing assistance, which we've talked about, mental health treatment, and trauma-informed services. Y'all, I'm sure know this. I will tell you personally, years ago, when I first heard the statistics about sexual trauma in the criminal justice system, it stunned me. It stunned me, and I've never forgotten the figures. And I don't know if these figures are still accurate today, but I can't imagine that they're too far off. I remember when I was in a training, and it was some brilliant evaluation person who said that when you cross women who are in the criminal justice system with women who are in substance use treatment, 89% of them have been sexually assaulted at some point in time in their life. So almost 90%. You do the same thing with men, it's 70%. And that's just one kind of trauma. So the folks that we work with in drug court, we're also going to have histories of trauma that we're dealing with, more than likely, with a lot of the folks. Having criminal thinking interventions, you're going to have a lot of folks who have been involved in criminal activity for a long time. One, actually, on the risk assessment, a few of the questions go directly to criminal activity. You have criminal associations. When was the first time that you can recall doing something that you knew was illegal? Those are questions that are on a risk assessment tool. Having family interpersonal counseling, we know more and more about how critical having the family involved in services and how the courts that do that have better outcomes. We talk about vocational services, just medical and dental treatment. Courts, and y'all know this, that have been dealing with methamphetamine for years. There's a lot of folks who come in who have serious dental problems. There's a lot of folks who come into the justice system who have serious medical problems. That also creates, it creates issues with how do we access that and how do we help these folks. Preventing high-risk behaviors, overdose prevention and reversal. One thing that NADCP has done a lot of work on in the last couple of years is reversal medications. And that's one thing with the opioid epidemic that we've heard a lot about is there's so many people dying of overdoses in the country now that it's like a major jetliner going down every day. It's either every day or every hour. I mean, it's terrifying when you look at the statistics and of the number of folks who are dying of overdoses every single day. And so the courts having to recognize that this is an issue, because when you're an adult, when you're working in an adult drug court, then it's not the statistic in your community. You're actually pulling out those people who are into your court, who are in many jurisdictions, the highest possibility to become that statistic, right? I mean, these are people who they have all these issues, and so looking for overdose reversal and looking to have a way to prevent that is a tremendous need for adult drug courts. Oh, there's a session. Jeff says there's a session on that. So here's an example of when to not be doing things, the timing of things. Don't begin criminal thinking interventions during phase 1. Enlist, why can't I say that word? At least one reliable pro-social family member, friend, etc. So you want to be able to tie people to positive interactions, and we've heard that for a long time. We've talked about timing matters. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. You can read it in the standard, and I think a lot of it's common sense, but knowing that it makes a difference. And I don't think that that's a surprise for y'all. Drug and alcohol testing is so critical. For example, we know now that for some reason 2 tests a week is ideal. And you can test more than that, but at least 2 times a week to be testing folks. That testing should be random and truly random. And I invite and encourage, if you haven't learned this, to read the standard, because I've worked with a bunch of courts, and I've worked with a bunch of courts who have told me, well, our testing is random. It's always either on Tuesday or Friday. But people don't know. I mean, they might not be asked to be tested that week, or they might be tested on Tuesday and Friday, or Tuesday or Friday. So that's random? I'm like, no, that's not random. So read the standard. So we talked about, in brief, we talked about the frequency, at least twice a week, random, the duration, breadth, all this is in the standard. Witness collection. I'm not going to go into that because I think Paul Carey, I know Paul's here, I saw him peek in the back door. Paul is teaching on drug testing. Paul is probably the only person that I know of who can teach about a process that starts with someone peeing in a cup, and he makes you laugh and love it and want to go back and hear more. I don't know. But what Paul will say about witness collection is that in your drug court program, if you don't have the ability or to actually watch the specimen leave someone's body and go into the receptacle, you may as well just use your resources somewhere else. And he'll tell you as a toxicologist, and because he's seen 1,000 different ways to do the drug test. But, and it's amazing when you hear the stories, and they're all funny and some are grosser than others, of how people manage to give you someone else's sample, but not their sample. And so anyway, if Paul doesn't mention that in his presentation, when you go to it, ask him. He'll talk about validity, he'll talk about accuracy and reliable, how rapid the results get. As a court, you want to have the results rapidly enough to make an intervention that's meaningful for the folks in your program, and then having the participants in some way understand what they're getting into. Have it into your contract if you have such a contract, that they understand the testing regimen, what's going to be required on their end. again, I'm going to kind of go through this because Paul's going to do this much better than I could. Multidisciplinary team. I cannot stress enough that for the non-judges in the room, even though the judges are the ones that have a standard, when you look at the research is unequivocal. Every person on the drug court team is critical to that team's success. When I asked how many law enforcement officers were in the room, there were several hands that went up. Law enforcement being on the team, on those teams that have law enforcement, it looks like from the research, have much greater outcomes. That piece is tremendously significant. There's sometimes there's a pushback about having the prosecutor or defense attorney on the team because the question in the jurisdiction is, well, do we have the resources to provide that? Well, one thing that the research has told us that those teams that actually have the defense attorney and the prosecutor have cost savings, which seems counterintuitive, is that, well, they're spending more resources to have that person there. Yes, but spending the money saves money. It's like putting the roof on your house before the house falls in. So having those people on your team will ultimately save money. It doesn't cost more money. Having training is critical. I love, probably of all the research, I love this one the most because it's kind of been, and Dennis Wiley can agree with this, my life's work. So to see the research come out where it was like, it's crazy. It's like 290% better outcomes for teams that were trained. And that shouldn't surprise any of us. I mean, it's like, imagine y'all are here getting training now. And many of you have been to trainings before. You've been to the national conference, you've been to conferences here before. Well, imagine if you just went and picked 6 people out randomly on the street and said, go start a drug court. Well, that happens a lot. I mean, I've certainly visited drug courts where nobody on the team had ever been to any training or read anything. I don't know for sure. I would imagine that some of those courts fall into the 9% that are having negative outcomes. But it was nice to see the research support that courts that have received training have outcomes that are multiple times better than courts that have not. I'm not going to go too much into this. There's a lot. This standard is great because it talks about, like it says on the slide, how critical the communication is and how the team should communicate. And it's, again, I cannot stress to you enough that it's so important what you do together as a team, but it's also so important, kind of as a side note, to also realize that you also never are able to give up your own discipline, like, for example, ethically. And that's like another whole training, but that's one thing that I never want people to lose sight of, that if you're a judge, for example, the judicial canons still apply. I mean, there's, and so they don't, just because you're a drug court judge, maybe whether it's full-time or part-time, when you're in that drug court, the judicial canons don't go away, everything else still applies. The same thing if I'm a defense attorney. If I'm a treatment provider, then federal confidentiality laws and state confidentiality laws still apply. They don't go away because I'm a treatment provider in drug court. I just have to use all of the tools that I have with the consents and everything else to be able to exchange information. The judge, this kind of goes, the first piece here goes to a little bit of the ethics piece. The judge in a drug court has to be the final decision maker because ethically a judge cannot give her decision-making ability to another person or another group, right? Makes sense. You wouldn't want a judge saying, I'm the judge, but Beth, you just tell me everything I should say, and I'll just do exactly what you tell me to do. Ultimately, Beth can make recommendations. She can give me good information. And that's not just in drug court, right? We get pre-sentence reports, just all kinds of information judges get, right? But it's ultimately whose decision? The judge. And ethically, it has to be their decision. Now, when I give a whole different session kind of on the ethical topic, that sometimes helps teams wrap their mind around that because you can see where you've got on the drug court team a variety of different experts, right? And they're giving the judge input. Well, the judge may follow the team's recommendation 100% of the time, but eventually even that judge will deviate. It has to be the judge's decision. The judge can't have you make the decision for them. They can take your counsel, but they make the decision. The defense attorneys, and just as a note that kind of is paired with this, I was working with a group recently on the presentation we give tomorrow on constitutional and other legal issues in drug court, and we were talking about the importance of having the defense attorneys on your court having an opportunity to talk to the folks in the court, both between staffing in the court, so that you're not springing something on people. And it seems like a kind of an intuitive type of a thing, but giving the opportunity, if Jeff's in the drug court and I'm the defense attorney on the team, I don't have the opportunity to talk to Jeff before we go into court and something happens. Does that make sense? And in doing technical assistance and training with courts around the country, just seeing how just that one simple piece, that when courts don't have that, adding it in, can smooth things over. For those of you that are defense attorneys, I see a lot of folks nodding their heads. You can imagine why. Drug courts should come to scale, meaning that drug courts should serve as many people as they possibly can given the resources that they have. But while they're doing this, and this goes back to what I talked about this a few minutes ago, drug courts should maintain fidelity to the model. Because what we know is that once fidelity slips, your outcome slips. And no matter how long you've been doing drug court, whether it's for 20 years or for some people in the room 6 months, drug court's a lot of work. Nobody wants to spend this amount of time working on it, and nobody wants to bring in folks into a program who are, beyond a doubt, the most vulnerable people in the justice system, and then not have the best outcomes. So what this standard talks to is talking to, when you get to a certain point in time, having, here it is. Having small enough caseloads, whether it's supervision or treatment, to maintain fidelity to the model, to have what you need to have service-wise to provide the services folks need to do to graduate, not letting it slip. There's one researcher who calls it, I think it is model slippage. But what she reported when she actually came and talked to the standards committee developing the standards was, in her evaluation, she had seen it time and time again, and I've talked about this before, but I want to reinforce it. Out visiting courts, without knowing it, and without having a process in place to do process evaluations and maintain fidelity of the model, when courts reached a certain number, they started making team decisions, and those team decisions were to depart from the model and to do things to make it easier for the team. And what happened was they saw their own outcomes drop. And then they went back and wondered why their outcomes dropped. And the evaluators were able to come in and say, well, at this particular point in time, you got to be a certain size and you stop doing all these things. And these things that you stopped doing were things that we know from the research. If you don't do them, you won't have the outcomes. Risk and need, I mentioned this when we started the standards. Every standard we've talked about depends on the high-risk, high-need caseload. So what we've talked about and what you'll read in the standards is fairly rigorous. But again, you're talking about bringing in the population in the justice system who are going to present with, in often cases, the most issues. And so that's why we have very rigorous standards and processes in place in order to have the best outcomes. So here, this just gives an example of what your caseload should be. You have high risk, high need, 30 to 1 or less, and then it goes into the other quadrants here. I don't know, have y'all seen this before? Anyway, so the other quadrants here, if you have high risk, if you have high need but low risk, so high need but low risk would be, I don't score high on a risk assessment, right? But I have a high need. So you could have someone, for example, who has serious substance use issues and mental health issues, but they've never been in the justice system before. They've never been arrested. They would score very low on a risk score. They would not be in your drug court then. Just like this person down here who was low risk, low need, would not be in your drug court because those would be folks, for example, in a first-time arrestee diversion case. If I was asked recently about somebody had a misperception of drug court. They were thinking that drug court was populated across the country by, people's nephew Brian, who was caught smoking a joint at university, had never been in any trouble before. And I was like, no. The people coming into drug, and we all know that, but I'll tell you, that's sometimes a misconception of the folks who are in drug court. People who don't work in drug court don't understand the kinds of issues that you're faced with. But in that example, Brian could very well be here. He just needs brief interventions and he'll be fine. High risk and low need is somebody who, I commit crimes, I might score high on a risk assessment, but I don't have any substance use or any mental health issues. Monitoring and evaluation. We have to monitor and evaluate what we're doing. That is easy to say. It's much more difficult to do. And I should have asked you, Jeff, and I don't know. In a lot of states that I go to, courts have problems with just the capacity and the ability to do that. The ability to ask certain questions. I mean, we have publications on what kind of information you should be collecting, but I do talk to a number of drug courts, but it's outside of that. I talk to a number of just courts around the country, and just any kinds of programs that are justice-based programs that don't have any basic data on folks. They can't tell you if, for example, African Americans have better or worse outcomes than anybody else, because no one's collecting that data. They can't tell you if men or women have different outcomes, because no one's collecting that data. So the first piece is to collect the data, and I talk to programs a lot about how it's virtually impossible to evaluate a program later on if you're not collecting the data at the beginning. You can't, and I've worked with programs so desperately. I mean, imagine this: I've worked with a program before that was like 12 or 14 years old, and they so desperately, after 12 or 14 years, wanted to go back and see how they're doing. But the only place they'd ever collected data was on paper. And so they had thousands of files of people who had gone through and successfully completed. They also had files of people who had been referred, but had either opted out or not come in. They had files of people who had gone through and not successfully completed. But these were all paper files. They would have filled this room. And so then, in order to go out and query that information, they would have to pay someone to do that. So when I'm talking to folks, I'm like, if you, one day, if your drug court's new now, one day you're going to want to know how you're doing. And even if you personally don't want to know, someone who's funding your court is going to want to know. It's much easier to start now with figuring out what data points you're going to collect. And NADCP, CCI, there's a lot of organizations, Jeff, who will help you determine that, but collecting the data now so that you have it when you need it. Now, what we would argue for is that you're collecting it now and you're constantly doing process when you can and outcome, and you're figuring out these questions, but you want to be collecting the data. You want to ensure that you're following best practices. I think I've beaten that horse. You want to look at outcomes in your program. You also want to look at the end. You want to look. One thing you want to look at is recidivism. Recidivism is a question that almost every funder I've ever talked to, a potential funder of drug courts, when I've asked them what would be in your top 2 or 3 metrics of success, recidivism is almost always number 1. And so knowing that, but then you have to define what recidivism is. I'm not going to go down that road, but you can imagine in the lawyers in the room, is recidivism a rearrest, is it a reconviction, etc. Having independent evaluators, that can be an expensive proposition. But again, if you can, there have been a lot of drug courts in the country that have successfully partnered with universities. Honestly, sometimes I've sent more draft dissertations from PhD candidates than I can't read them, because there's so many PhD candidates in the country who are working with drug courts and actually working on evaluations. So you can actually, there's ways that you can do that. There's ways that you can partner with folks. We talked about historically disadvantaged groups. The justice system in general is under a microscope for treating people fairly, so ensuring that you collect that information. I talked about electronic database. That is something that more now is more common, but certainly when Jeff and I were working with drug courts 20 years ago, I would say easily 2 decades ago, as many drug courts, if not more, didn't have any electronic database. Everything was on paper. And that's a fine way to have files to archive it if you want to go back and look at Carson Fox's file from 2001. But if you want to compare and evaluate Carson Fox's file with the 16,000 other people who have come through the program, as I mentioned to you, it's almost just an impossible proposition. When you get to that point in time, that one jurisdiction I've worked with, they basically realized it was impossible because of the financial burden on them to go through every single one of those files and pull that information. Now, one side note in that one too was, it wasn't just their files. The court had files, probation had files, and treatment had files. And they had decided not to collect all the information. They were collecting it piecemeal. So they would have had to have actually combined all the files and then culled out what they needed. So it was just virtually impossible. Comparison groups. I had a meeting recently and people were talking about drug courts. Actually, it wasn't drug courts. It was a different kind of a program, intervention program, being criticized because in their evaluation, their comparison groups didn't make sense. They weren't actually an apple-to-apple comparison. So who are you comparing your folks to? Time at risk is in there. I'm going to try to finish and not run over. Yellow is not. Is yellow the best color? Is that? Can y'all see that better? I keep trying to change the yellow and explain to them yellow is not. I thought it was just my eye. Analyze outcomes for all participants, including those who withdrew who were terminated early. This is one thing a lot of drug courts overlook. You're not just looking to the folks who successfully complete. What about those folks who were referred but dropped out? Remember that example I gave you just a few minutes ago about that court in California? So what ended up being a critical piece for them wasn't their graduates. It was when they looked at the program, they realized, wow, we're taking in a large group of people at the beginning, and virtually none of them are graduating. Well, why is that? And when they looked at the process, they realized they had to ask themselves, when are they dropping out? Are they dropping out in phase 3, whatever? And they discovered they're dropping out right here at the beginning. So it's not just looking at, oh, Carson graduated from your program, and he went on to get a master's degree, and blah, 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 blah. I remember years ago, an evaluator was in front of a room full of folks and said, I've looked at a drug court, I just evaluated them, they have a 97% employment rate of graduates. Are they a successful program? And almost everybody in the room said, yeah, they're a successful program. And he said, what if I told you that at intake people had a 99% employment rate? And then he went on to say, that's not an actual case, but he said, no statistic you have out at the vacuum makes any difference unless you know what it was at the beginning. And then you can extrapolate from there. So you have to be able to collect data at the beginning and data at the end. That very, very oversimplifies it. But I always love that example because everybody in the room nodded their heads and said, that sounds great, that's wonderful. And then he asked a simple question, well, what would make a difference if you knew? We all know this, and this is not just in drug court, this is in all the work that people do anywhere in the system. My mom's a teacher, and she has to keep exhaustive records. She works with developing disabled kids, and she has massive files, and she has to record for information, and it's a tremendous amount of work. My brother-in-law is a physician, the same thing. He talks about having to stay at work at the end of every day and just do files, report files. We know how all that is. We know that you'll forget things. I mean, I had conversations recently with someone where I knew that I was right. I knew that this conversation had taken place a certain way and went back and looked at my notes, and I was wrong. It wasn't the first time. So that's Terrence Walton's email address, and my name's on the first slide. So this is a perfect opportunity for me to say, email Terrence with questions and not me. But I actually will give you mine. Mine's the same format, but it's cfox@allrise.org. Usually T. Walton works better. Do y'all, I think, am I on time? Am I in early? Am I good? Okay, I got a couple minutes. Does anybody have any questions? It's a lot of information, and have any of y'all, or I won't ask this question, How many folks have seen that the standards, or if you've seen the standards, have appreciated that they're fairly skinny? I mean, these volumes are little. We work really hard, and the reason I'm going to put that out there for you is if you haven't read them, don't be daunted by them. There's a lot of folks who, when I referred them to the standards the first time, they expected to go to them and it'd be war and peace. We've worked very, very hard. Each one of these standards starts off with a black letter statement, and it says, this is what you should do. There's a title, there's a black letter statement, and then there's a few bullets underneath that kind of outline that. That's really what you need to know. Now, if you read further, then there's commentary. The commentary is usually not between like a page and a half to 3 pages. Maybe a little bit longer, and then there's the citations. And the citations are where, if you're a super nerd, like sometimes I am, you can actually then go in and go into each individual citation in each study. But you can read pretty much any one of the standards over a cup of coffee in the morning. Easily. They are very, and there's only 10 of them. So we've worked really hard to condense and condense and condense, knowing that y'all have 10,000 other things to do during the workday, and the standards were not designed to become something that was shelved. They were designed to be something that you could literally read through over lunch, and you could absorb, and you could talk about with your team. Any other questions? Yes.
Volume 2.
Oh, great.
There's almost a mandate that you do evaluations with comparison groups. And it seems to me to be really superfluous for us to think that every drug court in the country is going to have a comparison group and do an expensive, detailed comparison group study. And the reason that we developed standards was so that we know from historical comparison group studies that these are the standards that work. So why do we require in the standards in Volume 2 that we go ahead and do more, that every drug court do comparison studies that really, are, for most of us, are too expensive?
That's a great question, and I'll ask somebody about that. I will say this, it's a great question, but one thing that we're doing now, we're in the process of doing now, is we're going out and working with courts that are following all the standards, because to try to help the standards even more. Does that make sense? So that we're looking at courts and comparing courts that follow all the standards versus some of the standards and then grading them to see. But to go back to it, since the evaluations actually showed that was the best practice, there was discussion, do you include it or not include it? And it is, for some jurisdictions, a resource issue, but then there were also other things in here that were resource issues. What the committee decided on, the reason they're not called drug court standards, and the reason they're not called drug court best practices, is because they fall somewhere in the middle. Standards are, if you look kind of at the literature, standards mean it's a, from down on high, someone wrote it on a tablet, you have to do this or what else, right? Best practices are aspirational. We did not want to make them just aspirational because then people would ultimately not follow them, right? Oh, that's just a good idea. But making them standards and recognizing that would mean literally some people would figure that meant the next day, if they didn't have them, they didn't have a drug court, was also not fair. So we actually combined those words and called them best practice standards, which is really unusual. I mean, I don't know that you see that anywhere else in any field, because we recognize that our field, even though it's been around for 25 years, we've only now reached the level of research to have these. So there's going to be a period of time of years where courts even should achieve them, and it may be that things change in that period of time, but we also wanted people to understand the level of research behind them. Nothing made it into the standards unless multiple studies have said this is the way you need to do it, and this will lead to better outcomes. Does that make sense? So that was a huge discussion. I mean, that was probably half the day was 22 people going through and trying to figure out, because we didn't want to get into a situation where we created a document that everybody was like, it's just suggestions. But we also didn't want to get into a situation where we came out with it and people were like, wow, because it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot for courts to do that have all the resources in the world. So we needed courts to have time to digest them, to go through them, to plan for them, and things like that. So I hope that makes sense to y'all. And then also, sometimes when I give a presentation, I start off with an explanation of the title, so that gives me an opportunity to explain it. Another question here, yes?
Do you happen to have hard copies of this PowerPoint?
The PowerPoint, y'all have hard copies here?
We can get them. I mean,
Okay.
what we'll probably do is post them on the website, the Montana Drug Court website.
Y'all hear that? So post the PowerPoint, I would imagine for any of the ones that y'all should get for anybody's presentation. So, if you have any more questions, you don't have to ask me now. I'll be around this week, but you can also email me or Terrence. And we'll get you the answers that you need. Thank you so much. I'll see y'all next week.